Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back. My name is Ashleen Oliver. I'm the Executive Director of the Love and Fidelity Network, and I am your moderator for this afternoon. Before we hear from our next presenter, I'd like to recognize one of our sponsors, the Leadership Institute. The Leadership Institute is a donor-funded nonprofit dedicated to nurturing future conservative leaders. Since 1979, the Leadership Institute has helped young conservatives maintain strong voices on their college campuses. The Leadership Institute encourages student groups in their efforts to organize and invites them to obtain grants for visiting speakers. The Leadership Institute also offers a campus leadership program to help students grow their campus clubs and expand their reach on campus and beyond into other networks. The Leadership Institute offers valuable knowledge and free resources. To learn more, visit leadershipinstitute.org. Now I'd like to introduce our next presenter, Dr. Ashleen Menchaca-Bagnulo is a professor at Texas State University. Her research interests lie in Western civic republic tradition, particularly as represented in the thoughts of St. Augustine, Machiavelli, Montesquieu, and James Madison. Dr. Ashleen received her PhD in political science from the University of Notre Dame in the summer of 2013, with a primary specialization in political thought and a secondary specialization in American politics. She has served appointments as the James Madison Program under the Simon Postdoctorate Fellow in Religion and Public Life at Princeton University, and as a resident fellow in the Stockdale Center for Ethical Leadership at the U.S. Naval Academy, and more recently, a postdoctorate teaching fellow in Western and American political thought in the Tocqueville program at Furman University. She is interested in constitutional theory and American presidency. Dr. Menchaca-Bagnulo is pleased to have joined the faculty of Texas State in the fall of 2016 and to be serving in South Central Texas, her home, where she grew up. Please welcome Ashleen.
Hello, I'm so happy to get a chance to speak with you, and I'm so happy that you're interested in this topic, and I hope that I can return your interest with some quality, thought-provoking content. So I actually got into a lot of this when I was in college, and I encountered the Love and Fidelity Network through programs at Princeton. I was at school in Texas, and I think that it was really formative for me. So I hope that I'm able to tell you something formative for you. I've thought about this talk a lot, and I felt the need to sort of tell you things that I wish someone would have told me when I was at your stage in life. And I really came to the conclusion that I'm not even sure what I would have told Time Ashleen could have told young Ashleen, right? My talk is entitled Redefining Success, How to Win at Work and Home Life. But before I really try to talk about what that means, I want to spend a little bit of time talking about what it means to win. So winning is not something that we commit to at all costs, because there's no way that we can win if we do certain things. So if in order to win, we have to do something against our conscience, or we have to harm or destroy other people to win, you wouldn't call that a victory. You wouldn't call that a win. Winning is also not the same as vanquishing. It's not the same as dominating. It's not the same necessarily as being the best of all when we're talking about something like human life, the individual human life. The metric of our excellence is, frankly, how able are we to bring God or a higher power's will into our life in great and small ways on a daily basis. This is going to look different for everyone. And at the end of our lives, when we're dying, we're not going to be looking back and comparing ourselves to Becky with the good hair. Our retrospective is going to be much more intimate, much more personal, and much more particular. Now that I've sort of established what I think winning would entail by talking to you about what it doesn't entail, I'm presenting it as a concept of a completeness of life. However, I want to complicate a little bit of what I've said. There is one interpretation of what I just said as a kind of lowering of the sights for the aim of what women can achieve in life. This kind of argument often takes two forms. The first form suggests that we are incapable of the kinds of self-direction and human excellence needed to be able to possess the same kind of authority as men. So what it would mean to win for a woman in that case is going to be predicated on our inferior capacity. The second form suggests that we are equal to men in our capacities, but that for the sake of the common good, or for the sake of harmony between the sexes, that we should curtail or limit certain interests or the development of certain capacities. So I think that this is all complicated too by this particular backdrop, which is just simply true, that if you're a woman, you're biologically different than a man. And perhaps one of the most interesting and underexplored injustices in modernity is the influence an employer can have on something so personal and meaningful as decisions about marriage and reproduction, especially for women. On the one hand, it makes sense because our economic survival is tied to the good of our family. But on the other hand, it seems like a sort of gross disordering of the spheres of authority. And so I want you to keep that in the background of everything that I've talked about so far. Because what I'm going to do, I hope, is to try to think about what it would mean to win in your work and in your home holistically as a person, without trying to say that you have to give something up that is actually good and that you also want, but that you cannot obtain for whatever reason, whether it's the accounts you can't obtain because of your authority, lack of authority, or you can't obtain because it's not for the sake of common good. So what do I say in response? Okay, I've suggested that biological difference is real. I've sort of pointed to some ways that it impacts our social reality. So what way can I push against this? The answer is really complicated, I think, because the problem or the question is complicated. And for the answer, I turn to Heidegger at the end. I'll talk to you a little bit about the concept of standing reserve. And I'll try to conclude with some ideas about what this means for women's fertility and women's capacities. Now, I could talk to you for a while about some of the great social science research that has been done by some leading thinkers like Daniel Schneider or Brad Wilcox or Mark Regnerus. I could talk to you about some really wonderful work by Ana Samuel, Serena Seguilito, Catherine Pakolak at CUA about women and work. If you want to ask me for references to them later, I'm happy to send them along to you. I'm entering into this sort of space of women and pro-family arguments in a way that I want to make clear that there's a couple of things going on. First of all, it's my opinion that if you're making a sort of pro-woman, pro-family argument, you're already in a weird space. You're already kind of pushing against the norm, which is this idea that in order to have a certain kind of skill or authority as a woman, that the domestic life will just hold you back. And then so you have that bigger space, and we'll get into a smaller space, which is where conservatives or where pro-family people come down on this kind of question. My contribution here is to try to think about the way that people have come down on this question in the past, and to maybe offer another way of thinking about it. And this is part of why redefining is such an important concept for me. So a couple of ways that you will see these two sort of trends in Western political thought, and they're being renewed in contemporary conservative political thought, are sort of this subordinate but part of the whole argument I talked about earlier. That's Aristotle. And then the other one, I think, is, I called it separate but equal. And this is Tocqueville, though you see Chesterton and Wendell Berry also dealing with this. Some of the concepts that will continue to come up for us are the concepts of fertility and teleology. And you might be thinking, why are you talking to me about fertility and teleology? And the reason is because this is in the background of each of these theories. Now, this is what Aristotle says about being a subordinate part of the whole. He talks about the different kinds of rule that exists in a city. And remember, for him, like I tried to emphasize for me at the outset, it's the fullness of life, the wholeness of life, that is what matters for having a good life. And here he says the kind of rule that people possess is different. So the free man rules over the slave after another manner from that in which the male rules over the female, or the man over the child. Although the parts of the soul are present in all of them, they are present in different degrees. For the slave has no deliberative faculty at all. Okay, so in his account, the natural slave can't reason. The woman can reason, he says, but without authority. And the child, particularly the male child, has immature rationality that will eventually gain authority. If this is the case, then what does it mean for the fulfillment of duties? Women in this account do have a role to play in the human flourishing of themselves and of others. They also have the capacity for what is, for Aristotle, one of the highest marks of the developed human being, which is practical reasoning, sort of deliberating about the good and what you should do. But what they don't have is the same type of position, the same type of authority to be able to sort of call the shots, I guess you might say. And this, I think, again, goes back to the idea of capacities. So we have the capacity, obviously, to reason. It's not in an authoritative way, meaning not in a way where we're in control of our reason all the time. Sometimes it can be overwhelmed by emotion, he says. Not in a way that other people recognize as well, he says. But we have other clear capacities like reproduction. And so a lot of times for Aristotle, it's our capacities that will lead to our own ability to figure out what are the human excellences that we should seek to fulfill in our lives. Okay. Now, when we continue, you see that it's very important. He does not think that women do not have virtue. Okay, he thinks that we can have courage if you're a woman. He thinks you can have moderation if you're a woman. But he says that these virtues are actually different species of those kinds. He says the man's virtue is not the woman's virtue. The woman's virtue is not the man's virtue. So what does this actually mean in practice? It's kind of odd. And this is why I wanted to get into this position, because I wanted to push at this tension here. The well-run city depends on a well-run household. And the virtue of the part has to look to the virtue of the whole. So the well-run household has to look at what's good for the political community. And part of the way that what is good for the political community occurs is that we educate our children toward it, right? We educate our children to be able to apprehend what the good is and to act on it. Therefore, for Aristotle, women who are serious, that's his word for mature or prudent, they are able to make a big difference. And if you don't have women who are serious, they're not going to make a big difference in the city. At this point, you should kind of pause and say, okay, so women don't have authority. They have rationality, but it seems to be incomplete when compared to men for Aristotle. And this argument was a popular argument for a long time, and in some ways it still is. I remember hearing people not long after the election, qualified scholarly people, say, well, maybe women shouldn't vote because they're too emotional. So when you're thinking about women, you're thinking, well, it doesn't seem that they have the same range that men do. I think that's the best one. But on the other hand, you have this case where in order for the city to be happy, in order for the city to flourish, you've got to have a smart, capable, virtuous woman in the house. And she has to educate the children to be able to do this. And it seems weird that such a critical part of the good of the whole would be left in the hands of someone who ultimately has a sort of insufficient form of the rationality that is most perfectly found in men. When you turn to Aristotle's History of Animals, he actually says, and I'm not saying this, but I'm trying to point out to you sort of these parts of the Western tradition that we're dealing with. Aristotle says in the History of Animals that he finds women to be superior in every intellectual characteristic worth noting. Okay, he says they're more apt at rational learning, they're more considerate when rearing their young, and they have better ability to retain things in memory. Okay, so if you think then about what it takes for a political community to run, right? Wouldn't you want what Aristotle describes as the superior intellectual characteristics of the woman in the History of Animals to contribute to the prudence, particularly the prudence of the lawgiver? Okay, so the prudence of the person making the law in the city, especially concerning the rearing of the young. That's one of the top jobs, not just of the household, but then of the city. So it seems you hit this paradox. If women can be serious, if women can be prudent, if prudence is the art of the one who makes laws and the art of the homemaker, then why has it taken so long in Western thought to sort of come to a place where you could see women as being able to have the capacity to engage in different roles? Now, the next sort of objection I want to deal with, or objection in the history of Western thought, I see in a lot of great thinkers like Tocqueville and Chesterton and Barry, who have a lot of purchase in sort of this realigning conservatism that has a lot of good things about it, but in some ways I think isn't answering these hard questions correctly. So here I have a kind of funny story. Well, I think it's funny, but maybe maybe it won't be funny to you. I was giving a talk once, and I had this brilliant question from a male student, and it was on the subject of women in work. And like the good Aristotelian, he said, well, let's try to think of the thing that a woman can do that no one else can do. So women can learn, they can speak, they can deliberate, they can rule, they can manage, they can excel at sports, they can excel at art. Men can do all these things too. What's the one thing a woman can do that a man doesn't do? And that is to actually reproduce. The species in our bodies, right? So to get pregnant. And he says that tells us that by design, if women are able to pursue their interests and capacities with the same freedom as men, who will later go on to be husbands, then those men will have nothing else to do. Because the women will have the market on everything, and they'll also be reproducing the species. And in some ways, this is kind of a crazy question. But in other ways, I talked to young men, young conservative men, and they might not take it that far, but they are kind of concerned. Like, well, what do I do if it's the case that women are going to enter all these different spheres? And recently, there were some articles. One was in the New York Times. I think one was in Crisis. One was in Public Discourse, where there's this sort of longing for a conservative public woman's voice, right? Maybe we're seeing a sort of example of that longing and how much people are gravitating toward Amy Coney Barrett. However, then you also have people like Tucker Carlson or Jordan Peterson, I think he implies this, and people like Tony Easelin, all very wise people, who are saying that a part of the problem with the way that we live today is that women are trying to do everything. They are trying to develop capacities that have traditionally, at least in the further past, been the kind of things that men would do. And what this means is that the oikos, or the home, is neglected. And then with the neglecting of the home, you have the neglect of the political community. Again, very Aristotelian argument. So let's talk about this idea a little bit. Let's flesh out sort of where this concept's coming from. And I called this concept separate but equal. Here you have, for example, Tocqueville, who I love. He says, look, in America, this is how it works. Women and men don't believe that they have the duty or the right to do the same things, but they show the same respect for the role of each one of them, and they consider them as beings whose value is equal, although their destinies differ, okay? And he describes it as a kind of restraint on the part of the woman in the chapter on women and democracy in America, that she cultivates all of these different practices, and then when she gets married, she gives them up. And Chesterton actually says something similar. He says, look, the greatness of woman, the dignity of woman is to be like the fire. And so far in our discussion, what we've seen is these reflections on women from Aristotle, from Carlson, from Chesterton, from Tocqueville, all mostly are dealing with the focus of the division of labor. Okay, right? So here Chesterton talks about the division of labor. And he says that women's role in this is basically to be like the fire. What does a fire do? Well, he says it illuminates and it ventilates. So it brightens things up and it ventilates. I guess here he's meaning to sort of bring space, bring life, bring people together in a way where we can all have air at the same time. So to remain a flame, she should be protected. This is what he thinks. A flame is very gentle. A flame is not going to withstand certain types of duress. So things like the direct cruelty of competitive or bureaucratic toil are things, he says, that will put out the light of the woman. And if the light of the woman is put out, then she will not be able to illuminate the world or her home. Interestingly, the way that he discusses this is, again, a return to this idea of competence or excellence. So Tocqueville, is sort of clear. He thinks that women can develop all of these different excellences as well as man can. he just thinks they refrain, right, for the sake of the public-private divide. Chesterton says something similar, but he's much more explicit. He frames this discussion primarily in terms of labor, leisure, and excellence. So he's going to give an example of storytelling. And he says, look, storytelling is an art. Obviously, he thinks storytelling is an art because it's something that he does with his life, and he's committed to it. So storytelling is an art that is essential to the cultivation of children's moral formation. So it's something that a mother or a woman, if she's supposed to ventilate and animate society, is supposed to do, right? However, he says, it's not her job to seek out the startling revelations or the wildest winds of thought. But she should instead repeat stories well, with the acuity of a first-class cook. So she shouldn't come up with her own sort of kind of story. What she should learn to do is to tell the stories of men who've come before her and to tell them well. And I thought that the first-class cook analogy is a really good one, because if you're a good cook, you know, you probably know how to make lots of different things. And on the example of Chesterton, you are following recipes, right? So there's the good cook on his account is someone who's able to stick to the recipe and to be able to produce something that's tasty, right? So again, you have this idea that I mentioned earlier when I told you the story about the student I had, this idea of restraint. The virtuous woman, he goes on to say, shouldn't have one trade, but 20 hobbies. She, unlike the man, may develop all her second best. This is what has been really aimed for, he says, by what is called the seclusion or even the oppression of women. So again, you return to this idea that it's not about what the capacity is, it's about a sort of propriety. What is proper? Well, it's proper to a woman to be able to sort of do a lot of different kinds of things. But to do more than that is the job of a man. So here again, I suggest there's a tension, right? Which is that if women have this capacity, you know, that people are pointing to in the discussion that we've had, and you would say a human also has, these are human excellences. How is it just to do this sequestering? So there are some answers you could give at this point to my question, but I'm going to keep going, right, for the sake of extending the argument. And the thing I kind of have put to the side that I foreshadowed in what I was going to do earlier is this question of biology and teleology. Okay, so women have this ability to reproduce. Well, most of us do, right? In a way that is different than men, but it is the sort of one of the functions of women to do this. And you know, there's just nothing like it. I mean, I've had 3 pregnancies, 2 live births, and I've, you know, worked pretty much the whole time that I've done that. I think I took a couple of weeks of leave. But one of the things that I think I learned from this experience is that carrying a baby inside of you is something totally different than anything else I've done. And Soren Reeder, who is a feminist, who I'm kind of wanting to argue against a little bit, she brings up a really good point. She says that there's really nothing else like the sort of relationship that you have in motherhood, because it's what she calls a person-creating relationship. In no other relationship do you bring a person into being, and in as many and as profound ways as you do if you procreate, gestate, birth, and care for a becoming human being. I'd say a human being. We see bits and pieces of interpersonal creation in other relationships, in friendships, teaching, coaching, and fathering. But the fullness and multi-layered complexity of personal creation that goes on in mothering is nowhere even else approached. And here you see a problem, okay? I think I stated at the outset of this section that it's the case that we are going to have a very different experience of human reproduction than men if we are women. And then the next thing we see that Soren Reeder puts out there is that this type of relationship of reproducing, of person creating, she calls it, is unique. It's different from any kind of other human experience. And what she doesn't say, but what is also true, is that our sort of survival as a species depends on it. If it's this all-consuming, right? If it's this important, if it's this singular, if it's this different, this changes in our contemporary discourse what a woman is capable of achieving because of how we think of what it means to achieve in the broader secular society. So for most contemporary progressives, abortion is the solution to this kind of biological difference. They buy the account of human success and woman's success where we cannot integrate this sort of primary human relationship that Soren Reeder describes into the life of a woman who wants to also cultivate other parts of her being. And so the answer to this is to be able to have the authority to kill the child. However, one thing that I think they always overlook is that you can't unconceive what is conceived, right? Biological difference doesn't go away just because you can destroy the evidence of the difference inside the womb. The baby still came into being even though it wasn't sort of disclosed to the world, right? And one thing I learned from having a miscarriage is that on some sort of metaphysical level, once someone has been created, even if we never see them, even if we never meet them, there's a tangible change to what the world is and also what the world means for me. You know, it's a big question. What would it have been like if I'd never conceived the child that I lost? That they would have never come into being, right? That's a very different kind of future to think of, even though I never met them. And I think that because we haven't had a lot of discourse recently between women who are progressive on abortion and women who are not, right? Things like that are getting lost between the cracks. And all of the background of this is this question of what are women supposed to do? What are we supposed to be? We have the capacity to reproduce. We have these other capacities like to teach, to think, to write, to act, to speak. And we have them in a public-facing way, not just in a private-facing way. How do we fit these things together? Now, I think that there are really two ways that people deal with this question. And the first way I've already kind of discussed. You can completely suppress the woman's integration of her fertility into any achievement of any kind of excellence or freedom, right? So you'd say, look, in order for a woman to achieve anything, she has to have the ability to terminate a pregnancy. Fertility is sort of this rock or this chain rock that is holding her back, right, from how she should be. And in this sense, our fertility is kind of this foreign thing. But when you look at another possible response, which is the one that I was spending time with earlier and that I was trying to sort of bring to you and the people of Tocqueville, Chesterton, in their contemporary parallels, there are some people who suggest that the answer to the tension is to completely and wholly sort of subordinate women's freedom and development of human capacities to the capacities tied to maternity. Now, this doesn't mean forever. This doesn't mean only part of the time that you are older, right, it's sort of oftentimes a teleological argument that women should be educated and reared to be able to have this sort of role in life, and then they can move on once they've reared their children to sort of using these capacities in another way. Now, I want to say this is not a critique of women who stay at home. What I'm trying to do is to show that women's ability to choose the way that they're going to use their capacities is one that is broader than the contemporary sort of arch conservative or contemporary arch progressive accounts are letting us understand. Okay? This is because the way that we think about women as people and in society only exacerbates complications offered by, and this is where I might turn some people off and sound really crazy, I think there are deeply male-centered conceptions of equality, freedom, and fertility that the abortion debate presently occurs in. I remember being in the 4th grade, and I thought I finally found out what abortion was, and I said, oh my God, abortion exists so that I can be able to have sex like a man. In my 4th grader mind, this meant to have sex and then to just be able to leave, right? It's not how men have sex necessarily. But what I learned from that experience is that it means that the way that I was thinking about the world, even unconsciously when I was so young, is one where fertility is sort of my bugaboo or the lodestar of my life. So we're put into this place, if you're a woman, where you're tempted to think your capacity for pregnancy is something that is incompatible with accepted standards of human happiness and experience, or you're tempted to completely reject the parts of your experience of capacities for different kinds of freedom or human development that are outside of reproduction or domesticity. This polarization is a cultural polarization, and it's kind of freezing our minds on what we think women can do. So what does this mean about the future? A lot of it comes down to not so much a discussion of what men are and what women are, though a lot of that is important, but that when we're talking about women and work and destiny and happiness, the standout question for me, even after all this time that I've been thinking about this question and all the people I've read on it, is the question of fertility, that difference, right? So Rebecca Brannon-Weiss says, we make the mistake of thinking of women's fertility in the Heideggerian terms of standing reserved. Okay, and standing reserved for Heidegger is that which is ordered to stand by, but to be on hand. So an example might be a river that you can use for the creation of electricity, right? So you want the river to course and rage in a way that creates the sort of technological or productive capacity that you value. But when fertility comes out where it's not invited, then in this kind of technologically ordered society, it's scandalous. So if we can begin to untangle women's fertility from being understood as standing reserve, we might be able to bring the tensions I'm talking about together in new ways than what I brought up so far. Okay? So I think that one hint, one sort of possible way forward, and then I'll close, is to think about people in 3 ways when we think about what it means to be a human. You have women, you have people qua human, you have people qua gendered humans, and people as individual humans, okay? So in the first category, you find treasures of reason and revelation like the Imago Dei, or Aristotelian concepts as deploying human excellences and self-direction, okay? And then in the next category of gendered human beings, we've spent a lot of time discussing that with each other right now. You can even say that if you're interested in sort of obvious gender differences, you could look at how statistically men and women deal differently with grief. You could look at how they deal differently with feelings of insufficiencies. You could look at different trends and the types of degrees that they choose. The third category, though, is perhaps the one that requires the least explanation, but it's the most important, and that's the category of the individual. So as individuals, we possess tendencies, strengths, and weaknesses that are produced by our unique experience and existence and the particular raising and environment we have. If we emphasize the second category of the gender too much, there's going to be a part of what it means to be human that we're cutting off. But if we don't involve it at all, then we are also going to keep ourselves from understanding what it is to be human. The most prudent thing, though, is to be able to look and to see and to say that when we're thinking about our way of life, we are these three things. And our path needs to be something where we can combine them with prudence. That will look different for everybody. I don't want to be in a place where I tell people how to choose what their life should be, but I want to give them good tools to be able to, in incarnate particular moments of encounter and relationship, be able to say, this is the right path for me. Okay, so not like a cookie cutter, but one through lived experience. Thank you for listening to my talk.
The Western civilization's thought on vis-a-vis women and all the roles there. If you have not submitted a question, you can do so online via Facebook or YouTube. And while you're on YouTube or on Facebook, if you want to smash that like button or hit the bell to make sure you don't miss any future videos, you're more than welcome to. Ashleen mentioned a number of influencers and thoughts, such as Catherine Bacallef, Brad Wilcox, and Mark Regnerus. We've had the pleasure of hosting them at previous national conferences, and their videos are available on our YouTube channel. Ashleen, if I may, ask one exit question here. You talked about that there's a strong progressive side and, of course, a strong conservative side, and it seems that we're trying to find a middle path. Are there either practical pieces of advice you could offer for that middle path and or maybe even policy pieces of advice that you think could help underpin and flourish a middle path?
Yes, awesome. So the reason I focus so much on the theoretical right now in my talk is because I want to give us the conceptual resources for a middle path. I find a lot of people who want a middle path. I want a middle path. When I was young, I wanted a middle path. And it was hard for me to understand what that would look like because I couldn't even make the pieces theoretically fit together in my head. If you think that, if you take seriously the idea that your life has a telos, right, and that this telos is connected to nature, then the kinds of questions I talked about arrive. Now, practically speaking, what does this mean? One of the biggest things that I think happens is that we can envision ourselves as sort of, I guess you might say, like if your body is a whole, right? Now let's say you work on one part of yourself all the time, like one muscle. Let's say I worked on this arm all the time, and then it gets huge, right? But my other arm is little and weak. I think what happens is when we are conceiving either in this progressive way or this arch-conservative way, we can get this kind of tunnel vision where our idea of our lives that we strive for, and remember that sort of idea of your life that you strive for is what Plato calls, it's sort of the object of the demonic part of our soul, what we're trying to reach toward. So that image of your life, it gets really distorted. So I actually think that it starts early. It starts when you're young. It starts as you're learning how to be in relationships with other people. What kinds of life do you want to have? And what kinds of capacities do you want to exercise? And the truth is, for all humans, for us to have a complete life, like I said, you want to have a full life. You want to have a whole life. And in the actual living out of that, I think what you will find is particulars will present themselves to you. So I had a friend who was warned by a kind of famous scholar on women and family that she shouldn't finish grad school because she would miss her prime age of reproduction. Okay. And then I had another friend who delayed going to graduate school so she could have kids. Both of them have ended up being extremely happy people with well-rounded lives. And my friend who was warned to quit or she wouldn't find someone got married like 3 or 4 years ago. And then my friend who quit to be able to turn more toward her children, she was able to go back. And so my best advice is to you is to think about this as a kind of practical decision where you can't really judge the choice that another person's making. And when it comes to your own choice, it's going to be based on the particulars of your life, your particular calling, your particular job, your particular children, your particular husband. One thing I would warn, I remember when I was dating, I ran into, of course, the usual kind of mess where you have people like, they just want to fool around, right? But then I would meet more serious people and I was like really excited. And I remember thinking, wow, I'm so lucky to finally begin to meet these serious men. But when I first started dating more serious kinds of men, I remember all of them right away would bring up to me this question of whether or not I would discontinue my education to stay home and raise kids, because they wanted to be the one to continue their education or to continue their professional life, and they didn't think it could be done with two, right? And I get that perspective, but it wasn't for me. So on the one hand, I was really happy they brought it up early, but on the other hand, I kind of knew my own boundary. And because of that, I was able to date in a way that I was able to find someone I was more compatible with. One of the biggest things I think that has really come to me as I've been a mom and as I've been a wife is that the person you marry really matters. And that if they can think of your life as a collaborative effort and one that's one of give and take.
Thank you so much, Ashleen. I think it's critical. You raise a lot of great points to avoid falling into these simple either-or fallacies, or into these ideologies that are thin, that they're not robust, that they don't reflect true and a comprehensive human flourishing. And being able to have these conversations and explore all this is critical. Basing this on a deep philosophy is a great starting point, so that, as you mentioned, you now have something upon which to build your decision, so that your decision is not simply maybe going where the current winds take you, but rather something based on you're crafting your own life, a life that's filled with flourishing for you. And so we really appreciate you taking the time to join us today, to field our questions, and to explore these critical topics. So thank you so much,
Thank you.
Ashleen.
Thank you so much.
Our pleasure. It's been totally our pleasure. So thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, this concludes this presentation. And on the critical point of that either or fallacy, that will lead perfectly well into our next presentation. I will leave you with that teaser, and then we'll be back in about 2-3 minutes. So grab a cup of coffee, a glass of water, and get ready to rejoin us in a couple of minutes. Thank you so much.